Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And it's an enormous privilege and pleasure to welcome as our guest tonight, Sir Iain Duncan Smith, the former leader of the Conservative Party, former cabinet minister, and the co-chair of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, IPAC, which we'll perhaps talk about during the conversation. But Sir Iain Duncan Smith, thank you very much for joining us today.
Nice to see you. I apologise if my arms shoot up and down every now and then. My dogs have just walked into the room, so my apologies.
Right, no problem. Well, Sir Iain, perhaps I could just start by asking, over the course of the last year or so, you've been amazingly outspoken and energetic on China, including on Hong Kong. You co-founded IPAC, which I have the privilege of serving on the advisory group to. I wondered, where did this start for you, and why did you decide to take on China at this time?
Well, I have, to be honest with you, for a long time had real concerns about the nature and behavior of China, particularly since President Xi has come to power. It seems that the attitude shifted and they became more aggressive, less diplomatic, and more assertive. The second part of that is that I've been sort of arguing behind the scenes that government policy needs to take account of that, and that we'd become too dependent. It really all came to a head pretty much kind of after last election, because of course up until then Brexit had become so dominant, it was very difficult to sort of get the media to focus on anything at all, and particularly not at this stage China. So it became to a head really with the Huawei debate, where a number of us, myself included, decided that actually the idea of allowing Huawei into our 5G was terrible and posed significant security risks. So we seem to have lost track of the security risks with China, and we're now doing almost anything to get business and to buy cheap product. and so that actually began back at the end of last year and then the beginning of this. Now we did manage to put an amendment down, but that didn't succeed, although we succeeded in the argument in due course, and Huawei were pretty much going to be banned from the British system, telecommunication system. So all of that was the run into it and how it worked. But my interest in China has gone back a long, long way. I was only saying the other day to somebody that my great grandfather set up a trading business in Fuzhou back in about 1860, 1870. And he lived there. He's actually quite an interesting man, because he had captained the King of Siam's yacht at about the time of the film depicts The King and I. That stage, that was when he was there in the household, as it were. But he set up this trading business in Fuzhou. My grandmother was born. He married a Japanese lady who was a member of a samurai family, and that was after the Meiji Restoration in Japan, when the samurai lost all their special privileges and everything else, and a number of them came over to China, and she came over to China with her brother, and she eventually married my great-grandfather. They had a number of children. My grandmother was one of them. She was brought up, obviously, for most of her child life and also adult. She married an Englishman who went out there to set up the Chinese Postal Service under Sun Yat-sen. And they then married. He was a fluent Mandarin speaker, and she spoke Mandarin. They had two children. My mother was one of them, and they grew up in China. And eventually they left in the late 30s and came back to England. And my uncle was then sent back to China in the Second World War because of his Mandarin, and he had very good Cantonese as well. And he worked with the Americans and British, and at that stage, the Chiang Kai-shek's government in Chongqing, I think it was. I don't know if it's changed its name these days, I can remember. Basically helped defeat the Japanese, and then came back to England afterwards. So my links with China really are that I'm probably the first generation not to be born in China on my mother's side for 3 generations, really.
Absolutely fascinating. I knew none of that family history. Have you yourself traveled much in China or to Hong Kong?
I've been to Hong Kong a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, and I think I think it's 2 or 3 times. Certainly Taiwan I've been to, and I spent time on business in Beijing a number of years ago. I think this would be probably back in the 80s, long before any of the the significant opening up took place. So you could still, in Beijing, you would still see the streets, with those Chinese cabbages piled high, being sold on the streets, and things were much more traditional then. I think there's been huge change since then, but certainly the vast majority of people either walked or traveled on bicycles. The cars were very few and far between on the streets in Beijing in those days. And I remember going there actually on business and staying, interestingly, in what had just been turned into a hotel, but in fact had been the headquarters, I think, of the secret police or whatever it was. And I was the only Westerner, as it were, in the hotel. They had nobody spoke English at all
Wow.
in the hotel. And it was my experience of realizing that many of the niceties that you expect elsewhere didn't exist. So the food arrived whenever it was ready, if you know what I mean. So you would get almost anything at any time, just as it happened to be ready. It was great, actually. I loved it, but it was just beginning to open up then, and you had a few modern hotels, but not a lot. So yeah, it was fascinating. So I've done a bit in China. Yeah,
That's fascinating. Last year, you came together with an extraordinary cross section of parliamentarians from a huge range of countries and a huge variety of political traditions to form IPAC. Can you tell us a bit more about the motivation behind IPAC and what IPAC does?
Well, it was an idea that myself and one other came to, which was we wanted to set up an international organization that brought together all those who had concerns, like-minded concerns, in the free world. And we didn't want to make it party political, so we decided to have a co-chair, or one on the left, one on the right. And we then set it all up in that regard. It was meant to draw attention to the growing dependency of the free world on China, which at that time we said was unhealthy and needed resolving. And to my great surprise, it didn't take us very long, but I think we've ended up with 19 countries now as members, from Japan to America, Australia, New Zealand. Then we've got Scandinavian countries, mainland European countries. We've got some countries in Africa. So it's been quite intriguing how quickly people sort of joined and set up their own sections of it in their own countries. And we meet fairly regularly. Obviously, time zone issues make it a little more difficult, so we often meet UK time quite late at night. But it seems to work, and we've managed to engineer a number of things in cooperation. So the idea was to try and help send a signal that the free world needs to come together to deal with this Chinese problem, because it is a growing problem, and unless we decide we're going to deal with it and figure out how to stop the Chinese behaving so badly and trying to be so dominant, otherwise it's get worse for us, really.
Absolutely. You served in David Cameron's cabinet at the time when the UK position was championing a so-called golden era of Sino-British relations, and that led, of course, to a number of things, including Chinese investment in some of our critical infrastructure. It also led to the British government being very, at the time, very quiet or weak on the situation in Hong Kong back in 2014, when the umbrella movement happened and the erosion of freedoms that followed from them. It's only really in the last year that the government's position on Hong Kong has become much more robust. What are your reflections looking back at that period, and what led to the so-called golden era? And I presume you would say it's a mistake, but how did that mistake come about?
Well, I think it was a mistake, and I was concerned about it at the time in cabinet. I was a little more focused in those days as Secretary for Work and Pensions on the big reforms. We had huge reforms going through, and I just took this point that I would focus on those, come to other issues that I thought were important. So universal credit, all these very, very big things that we now work and I think are doing well. They were all my big focus. But I did at the time question whether we were not going to become too close and too dependent on China. I must say, when President Xi visited at that time, I wasn't happy at all because his record was not great. And I remember having to listen to him in the Royal Gallery when he came to be, he was given a joint session of Parliament, and I thought his speech was terrible. It was arrogant. It was very much about how China's natural place pretty much is to be, the dominant power, and that, countries like the UK were just, here today, gone tomorrow kind of regimes, but China continues. So I was quite taken aback. In fact, I gather it was nicknamed, but I remember saying this myself, so we may have all arrived at this at the same time, but the policy was never known by its golden, whatever it was, nomination. But it was actually nicknamed Project Kowtow, because it seemed that all we wanted to do was to bend to China and do whatever China wanted. And we wanted their students, and we wanted their money and their investments. And there was never any limit, the nuclear power. And so I was already concerned at that stage, but other things kind of moved and drifted. Brexit was a big thing that happened in the 2016 period and stayed with us unexpectedly all the way through till basically the last election. So it's very difficult to move beyond that. But Project Kowtow, I think, was about a good name for it, really. And breaking that is critical. The government maybe hasn't quite made it to that point, but certainly it's going to.
The United States government seems to take what you might call a whole of government approach, whereas Britain, it appears, doesn't. You have the Treasury pursuing its agenda, you have the Foreign Office, and other departments. What kind of reform do you think, in terms of government policy making, is needed to have a coordinated cross-departmental China strategy?
Well, I think all policy originates in Downing Street at the end of the day. So the Prime Minister has full sway if he or she wishes to decide what the relationship with their country would be, in this case, China. And I think the others are meant to follow suit. But I think actually in this case, it goes a bit deeper than that. I think there's no question that the UK government is conflicted here and hasn't figured out how to resolve it. I think they're conflicted, as other governments were in the past. This isn't unique to the present Conservative government. Cameron's government was in a very similar position. So was Theresa May's. You go back to Blair's and Brown's. There was a definite shift to supporting businesses' desire to get cheaper product and cheaper services from China, and the rush to get investment from China. And I think that has percolated all the way through. So we've got departments that are still on that agenda, whereas politics is moving. And those departments, I think, are fighting it. They don't want it to move particularly. And there are obviously clearly individuals involved in that. I'm not going to go through who they are, but that is the key point. And so the reality for us is that we need to properly, I've always felt, do a check on our dependency, our financial dependency and our political dependency on China, which has gone far too far. With other decisions about nuclear power stations, I find it astonishing. And with Huawei's decision, which had to be reversed, there are issues around TikTok. So my view really is Downing Street needs to give a lead on this, and they need to say, actually, we're shifting our position. We need together to figure out how we can do greater levels of business with other areas of the world, some of the free world, other areas in the developing world, and lessen dramatically our dependence on China. And in so doing, actually, we also, the one thing that China has is also the one thing that we have, which is that they rely on investment and growth dramatically. And it's our money and the money of the free world that has massively fueled that growth. But if they don't grow at 5 or 5.5%, they're standing still. And that means really, if we don't invest so much in China, it makes China's position more difficult. And at that stage, it may be better and easier to do what I would call more balanced business with them, or have a more balanced relationship, and literally be prepared to call them out over things like Hong Kong properly, Taiwan, South China Seas, this terrible engagement they've had in India on the border. And these brutalizing processes that they're engaged in need to stop. And the only way to stop that is to let them know that we do understand that we also have power, and that power is mostly commercial. and that commercial power should be used as a part of policy.
Absolutely. To what extent do you think the City of London and its ties and interests in China, and I think particularly of the obvious example of HSBC, to what extent is the city an obstacle to this?
Well, some parts of the city are. I think HSBC behaved appallingly over Hong Kong and continues to, as far as I can see. I think it actually froze the accounts of some of those who had actually fled Hong Kong the other day, which I thought was outrageous. But there are some banks. But I think by and large, the city will go where they think the risk is least and the returns are greatest. And at the moment, China has offered them that, particularly through Hong Kong, but also because, they've been very, very keen on achieving that investment level for them to grow. But I think if we find alternatives, if we start coming together to look at other ways of doing it, I think the city will finance those as well. I think the city goes where it finds it, as I say, easiest to make the money and at the same time have the highest returns. But I think that there are other countries. I think we should have much closer ties now economically with India. Would be really important, and to bring together, at last our attempt to get into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think that's a very good idea because that also locks us into a very, very high growing, but also very powerful area, which would be good for us and would be good for them as well. So these are alternatives, I think, and we should look to start to use our commercial power with our allies to say to China, you simply can't behave like this any longer. There is a rules-based order out here and you need to obey it like everybody else should. The WTO, it needs massively reforming and refreshing, no question. But it is the basis of a rule-based trading order, and you can't just dismiss anything it does, subsidizing your own industries, deliberately putting other businesses out of business around the world as a policy. All this sort of stuff has got to stop. And that's only on the commercial side. So I think it's very important we all get together, that was the point of IPAC, and discuss how we can best lessen our general dependency on China and make it clear to China that there are consequences if you behave badly. There are economic consequences to you. And that's, again, where the genocide argument comes in as well, because it's part of that process.
Absolutely. In the case of working internationally on the situation in Hong Kong and trying to gain support for Hong Kong, one of the obstacles that we've encountered is China's growing influence at the UN and with certain countries through its One Belt, One Road initiative. And the UK government, of course, was one of the earliest supporters of that and was the first European government to join China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Do you think that the government should now reconsider its support for One Belt, One Road and work together with like-minded partners to try to dilute China's influence in these multinational institutions?
And no question, we should now be reducing that. One Belt, One Road has now become very clear. It's a process to tie developing countries into China in an economic sense. And instead of joining it, what we should have been doing is offering alternatives. I mean, one of the problems why so many of the developing world goes to China, because China will give them money and support quicker and with what appear to be fewer costs. However, the hidden costs always come home later. For example, if they're building a telecommunications setup in a country, as I know they have done in a number of countries, by all means, they will offer the money, but then they will make you pay for what is essentially Chinese systems to be installed, and often installed by Chinese engineers and even at times some Chinese laborers, which means basically the money they've lent you comes back and you still have to pay it back. So that makes you tied to China, both economically and strategically and technically. So this is a very short-sighted move on Britain's part. I think the One Belt, One Road has a strategic objective to it, and they are achieving it, which is to bring into their fold and under their sway other countries that look to China for their financial support and for their technical support. And I think it's a short-sighted position for the West to have allowed this to grow underneath their noses, as it were, and in our case, and as in one another's, is to play any kind of part in it. And I think what we now need to do is to recognize that what the market's missing at the moment is an alternative. And we need to shape that alternative properly. Now, we have a very good record on overseas aid, but we need to work together with the others to make sure that what we do gives people choices, give countries choices. They don't have to become dependent on China. But that does, you're right, mean that when it gets to the UN, whether it's anything really, genocide or criticism, it automatically gets blocked. And that's because they have successfully managed to cement relationships through, as I said earlier on, the financial reward scheme, which means that you need to ask the question, is there anything that China does that's not strategic? And the answer is no. They own 85% of the rare earth material mines now, which is basically all the stuff that goes into the making of this thing that we're on at the moment, telephones, batteries as well. So they have the largest production facilities for rare earth materials in the world. And also they produce the largest numbers of batteries in the world. And we're talking batteries for vehicles and cars and buses, and they build electric buses. And the thing is, they strategically set out to dominate that market, and they will too, because they will do it cheaper right now than the UK. So as the UK turns to electric vehicles, which I think, by the way, is a mistake, I think hydrogen is the future, not large batteries in cars, which are, by the way, you have to put most of them into landfill, which is not exactly very green. But who's building all those? Well, China, of course. So that means we'll have a greater level of dependence on China, which is a really vital question. And so it goes on, really. And my question really is, does the government really think through now our strategic position? And I think we need to recognize that we need to balance it. And it's very unbalanced at the moment.
Turning specifically to the situation in Hong Kong, what are your reflections as you look at the dismantling of freedoms, autonomy, the rule of law, which were promised to the people of Hong Kong, and not just promised in a sort of vague way, but promised actually in an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration? What do you make of what China has done over the last several years, but most dramatically the last 6 months?
Number one, I don't think it's surprising, but number two, it's appalling. So all the signs were there that China was going to step in at some point. And when they did, they were going to step in fast, and they don't really care about the treaty. I've long since held the view that the only reason they ever came to this treaty with the UK was to set an example of a compromise system with one country, two systems, that would attract Taiwan. Taiwan is the big prize for them, not Hong Kong. They needed Hong Kong, obviously, because as a financial center, it was a gateway into China, but and they needed it to function like that. But I think the truth is they want Taiwan. And this was always meant to indicate to Taiwan, don't worry, because, we're not asking you to make major change, but you will come under the suzerainty of China, but you can be like Hong Kong. I think when Taiwan elected a government last time of asking, which is very anti going in under the umbrella of China, I think that was the last straw, and Hong Kong's demand for democracy again was a problem. And I think in the end they just decided that it's not going to make any difference to Taiwan's attitude, so they might as well not put up with the demonstrations and the problems in Hong Kong that were inherent in the original agreement. And so that's why I think that as I say, they cracked down quickly, because they're no longer looking over their shoulder at Taiwan, because their view is we're going to have Taiwan one way or the other in due course, and hence their great ambition by 2049 to be the strongest military and the strongest economic power in the world. So yeah, I think it was always inevitable, but it's appalling, but a very good indication that China doesn't let things like treaties stand in their way if they don't agree with them. And now this is the terrible sign of all dictatorial regimes down the ages, and particularly in modern times. You only have to go back to the Second World War to look what happens when you do nothing, when a country decides that the law is its to break or its to make. Germany, Italy, all of that sort of stuff that went on in the Second World War and the run to it, we turned a blind eye to most of it. Very few of the government were were thinking that they needed to stop Germany early on, hence the appeasement stuff. And in a way, that's really where we are. We've said a lot about Hong Kong. We've definitely, suspended the extradition treaty, made it very clear that we don't approve of what they're doing and that they've broken the Sino-British Accord. It's an international treaty. But we haven't gone even further than that. The Americans have gone further than us, and it's not even a territory that they actually had any original historical links to. So they've introduced these sort of Magnitsky sanctions against individual officials. We could have done that by now, but we haven't done it. We aren't even talking about the Uyghurs at this point, but we could have done that to them as well, but we haven't done it. So I think that this is the problem with being compromised in your dealings economically with a country, is it tends to influence your thinking politically. And my problem is right now is that I suspect that we're not too keen to do too much to demand China stops what they're doing, because we may upset them, and that may turn to a problem for business. So my sense about this is that this is where the compromises start. And whilst we have protested quite rightly, and we have said we have a right to do it, which we do because we are co-signatories, and for 50 years they were meant to stand with the original treaty. So all of that, I think, gives us a right, but we've used the right, sparingly would be an unfair word, I think, but I think we've used the right not as to the extent that we could. And I think, therefore, sanctioning individuals. I mean, it was very good we gave the BNO passport rights to Hong Kongers, and that was a great, generous move, and I'm pleased that the government did that. But we need to react to China's recent announcement that they're not going to recognize them. Now, that doesn't stop people coming to the UK. It stops people who aren't very wealthy coming to the UK. I think it has the biggest effect on those who probably need to get out of there the most. So all of this, I think, needs to be strengthened, and our policy with regards to China needs to be toughened up.
Absolutely. Just building on your last point about BNO, we're speaking, of course, in the week where the BNO scheme has just opened on the 31st of January. And as you say, it is a very generous offer, but there are perhaps both opportunities and challenges around integration and welcome. What are your reflections both on the opportunity that Britain has of a large number of Hong Kongers coming to the UK, but also what we should be doing to make sure that they are properly welcomed and given help to find their feet here?
Well, I think the British public will welcome them. We welcome the Ugandan Asians who were in a similar situation. And to be fair to the Ugandan Asians, many of them came over with just a suitcase. And we have two families now that are in Conservative politics that have been in government. One who's been in cabinet and the other one who's a minister. And on top of that, you only have to look around you. You can see all the companies they've started from nothing, the success and the revenue they brought. I think many of the Chinese will do much the same. They're very industrious and very hardworking people. And when they come on over, we will welcome them. I think the British public recognize the hardship they've gone through and will open their arms to them. We need to organize that, though. That's very important. The government needs to make sure that's all properly organized. But we need also to make sure that those who need to come can come. And also, which we've been doing, talk to other countries like Australia and others and ask them to share the burden of taking what could be large numbers, we don't know at the moment, including the Americans. And I'm told everyone is being positive about that. I mean, I would suspect quite a lot of those from Hong Kong won't want to travel too far away from their own homes. I suspect what they'll want to do is to stay reasonably close by. So that's why it's important for countries like Australia and America, etc., to be guarantors, including even Japan, if they can. So if people wish to stay within striking distance, they can. But I expect a fair number to come to the UK.
You've touched on Magnitsky sanctions, and I know you and it seems to me pretty much whenever I watch a debate on Hong Kong in the House of Commons, you and almost every other member of Parliament, except the minister, call for Magnitsky sanctions to be imposed both on the leaders in Beijing for what they've done to the Uyghurs, but also on Carrie Lam and other Hong Kong officials. Yeah. Why is it, do you think, that the government still hasn't moved on this, given the weight of parliamentary pressure that there is?
Well, I think I think for all of us a little bit of a puzzle, but I suspect in truth it comes down to a desire not to take the step at this particular point that upsets the Chinese, and they say they'd rather do it diplomatically, raise their objections diplomatically, all of which is very reasonable. But I don't think we're dealing with a reasonable country. So it's time we stepped up to this. And I just say we're going to keep on asking. And each time we ask and each time they say no, the reasons for saying no look more and more ludicrous. My instinct is there are members of government who want to do it, but at the moment, I don't think Downing Street has given it the go-ahead, and I think that's the key.
Let me move just to the last few questions. You mentioned earlier in the conversation, and I wanted to come to this, the genocide amendment, which for our viewers passed the revised amendment passed the House of Lords yesterday with a majority of 171, and comes back to the House of Commons with your leadership and Nusrat Ghani's and cross-party support next Tuesday. Could you just say a little bit about what the amendment seeks to do, why you're championing it, and what its implications for China policy and particularly the impact on Hong Kong, because it's been framed specifically in regard to the Uyghurs. Of course, no one is saying Hong Kong is in any way a genocide, but there may be implications for Hong Kong.
Yeah, no, it's first and foremost, it's not just about China. So the genocide amendment would apply to any country that we thought or was thought to have got close to, if not committed a genocide. I mean, you might argue the Rohingya were a genocide case. I don't know. The key thing about genocide, and people often don't know this, is only a court can decide on genocide. Now, it was always intended that the International Court would decide on genocide and the criminal court would decide on individual responsibility. But to get to those, you either have to be signatories to the convention or you have to go through the Security Council to get to the ICC. So the problem is every time China blocks it. In the first case, China has to acquiesce. In the second case, China has to agree it in the Security Council. And that wouldn't happen in the case of the Uyghurs. It wouldn't happen in the case of many other nations that are close to it. You know, we look at Burma, for example, at the moment. China is very close to Burma. Would China agree for a case on the Rohingya be referred to? I doubt it very much. I doubt it very much. And so this is about all genocide. The reason why we want it to go to a UK court is because I have huge respect for our courts in the UK and their impartiality. And the second thing is we can't get it to the international courts, but if we get it to a UK court for a preliminary hearing, a preliminary judgment, then whether it's the Uyghur or whoever will have a chance to bring their case. The bar is incredibly high to pass for a genocide. You literally have to prove categoric intent from those who govern that their purpose and policy was the eventual eradication of an ethnic or religious group. So that's a very high bar. It requires very high levels of evidence, which means there won't be that many cases ever brought to the court on this. But the court is capable of understanding the quality and power of the evidence. And I think, therefore, because if a court decides it in the UK, that should allow UK politicians to call it genocide. And the moment we call it genocide, then that brings into question all sorts of things with trading arrangements with that country, all sorts of areas we may have to work to persuade other countries to do the same, and so on and so forth. So it does start to bear pressure on a country that up until that stage knows very well that ordinary countries can't call it genocide. I hear the American Senate and the House of Representatives called it genocide the other day, but the honest truth is, I don't think it has any effect at all. I mean, people recognize it because it's not a court. It means they haven't gone through a process that only a court can go through to decide on the balance of evidence. So that's why a court, so the argument isn't, should it be a court? Because even the Prime Minister here has said, no, only a court can decide. The argument is, which court? That's all. And in our case, we're saying, let's start with the High Court. And it'd be great. The government can then take that up to the UN and demand, the ICC or whatever. And if then the Chinese or whoever vetoes it, then the government can say, we're going to take unilateral action. But, there's lots of things you can do. But the important thing is you must start with the finding of genocide, and only a court can do that. And that will apply to any other area that falls under this. I mean, there are some arguments in China. Are they systematically trying to eradicate the Falun Gong, who have had, organ transfer, they've had harvesting of organs taken place against their will, all this sort of stuff taking place, which, may lead you to the conclusion that it could be genocide for a religious group, but we'd have to prove that. And so I'm saying it until that's done. But I think it will certainly make the Chinese sit up at that point, because they must begin to add things up and recognize that the free world is beginning to ask very serious questions, and particularly so since COVID. The deceit. There's a very good program that's been going the rounds on BBC, I think, the last couple of days. And that demonstrates, without doubt, that the Chinese suppressed the information over COVID for various reasons. Might be to do with the trade deal with America, might have been to do with their determination that they shouldn't be seen to ever lose control of anything. Whatever it was, they did. And that period that they were silent on, which is certainly December and into mid to late January, that is probably the reason why the UK has seen very high death rates, Germany, France, America, because people had traveled by that stage and carried their virus to all sorts of countries around the world.
Absolutely. My penultimate question for you, the Chinese regime in the last few years, it wasn't always like this, but the last few years has come to be known for its wolf warrior diplomacy, as they call it, increasing aggression, bullying, threats to critics well beyond its borders. And I wondered, firstly, given how outspoken you've been, whether you've been on the receiving end of any of this, and what effect do you think the wolf warrior diplomacy in inverted commas, has on the free world?
Well, I think that kind of a policy, you're right, I think it has shifted. I thought it shifted about the time President Xi came in, but I suspect it really began to shift after Tiananmen Square. But you can calculate that whereas you lie. But there's definitely a shift, and it's a shift towards the direction of said, we're China, we're big, we're powerful, probably the second largest economy in the world, certainly, pretty much, if not as powerful as the Americans. We're not far behind, and our ambition is to be as powerful as they are, if not more powerful. So, you can see that as that has developed, China's attitude of intolerance to nations that don't get them is profound. And that intolerance means that they have to then suppress any bad information, difficult detail, or, even rather than ignore it. And so this is where we've got to really with what you referred to as the wolf warrior process, which is their way of hunting out and silencing critics, either by making their lives a misery or by frightening them. But that is very much the question now. So it's very much the pattern of behavior. But what concerns me slightly is, well, a lot actually, is Western governments not coming together to deal with this problem. We should have been dealing with it ages ago. We've seen all sorts of stuff come from China, not least of which is cyber war from China on a significant scale, but also, the undermining of individuals. Now, I haven't had a huge amount happen to me. I'm not, I may have been targeted, who knows, but I'm not aware of anything. But there are some that have been roughed up good and proper in technological terms and on the internet and things. But it doesn't stop you doing what's right. You just have to carry on, really. And the answer is, look, China can't go on behaving like this and expect the world to turn a blind eye. This is all we're asking through IPAC, is stop turning away, confront the problem, deal with it, make sure China changes its ways, or they don't get their investment and they don't get their business. And these are things that they desperately need. But at the moment, they're getting a free ride, and I think that has to stop.
Absolutely. My last question, we're coming up to Chinese New Year at the end of next week. It's the year of the ox, and I looked up the characteristics of the year of the ox, and it's, of course, puts it this way: diligent, dependable, strong, determined, hardworking, and stubborn, which seem to be quite good descriptions of Hong Kongers. But I wonder what message you would have for people from Hong Kong, people in Hong Kong, or people who've left at this dark time for their city as they begin the year of the ox.
Well, I hope the year brings greater hope. I mean, I like many others, have been appalled by the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party towards Hong Kong. And I hope the West, the free world, will come together more in this coming year to be able to put a straight face with a united front to China's misbehavior, obviously in Hong Kong, and those that stay there. I try and see it through. I do wish that this pressure works. First of all, we get it going, and secondly, it works. So I offer out the hope that people's lives will improve. We've just lost the life of Captain Tom here, or Captain Sir Tom, as he became. And I am struck by the one thing he used to say all the time: tomorrow is going to be a good day. Tomorrow will be a good day. And I think in the more rhetorical sense, an area like Hong Kong, with such vibrancy and go-getting nature and wonderful enterprise, I just wonder whether China really can contain that under a more strict regime. I think people have tasted freedom in Hong Kong. I don't think they're going to let it go. And I wonder whether at the end of the day, Hong Kong won't change China, which is my powerful hope.
Well, that's a wonderful note on which to end. Sir Iain Duncan Smith, thank you so much, both for talking with me today, but also I think on behalf of not only Hong Kong Watch, but I know the people of Hong Kong, we deeply appreciate the efforts you've made, the leadership you've taken on these issues. And we wish you every success, both next Tuesday in the vote on the Genocide Amendment and in everything else that you do with IPAC on these key challenges of our time. So thank you very much.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for doing the interview.
My pleasure. Thank you.